There is a moment in everyone's life, I think, when the air goes sharp and you realize what it feels like to be truly alone in a room full of people. That moment for me came when I was 21, hands shaking on the lacquered edge of a violin, which I had built from a pile of maple and spruce over 6 anxious, sleepless months. We called it a studio critique, but it felt more like standing trial, except the verdict, guilt, was already printed on everyone's lined faces. The studio was on Oranienstrasse, a grey slab of a building shuttered by heavy doors and always smelling of glue and varnish, even in the depths of December. Our instructor, Herr Futsch, was a relic, thick eyebrows, thicker accent, the kind of man who could spot a misplaced chisel stroke from across the hallway. We sat circled in battered metal chairs, a dozen students in our work jeans, the fourth years on one end, us novices blinking in the pale window light. My violin waited on the table, glowing faintly with the newness of its finish. Elias, Futch said, not looking up from his notes, please. I wanted to swallow my own name, but there was nowhere to hide. I stepped forward, the floor creaking under my boots, and offered the violin to him with both hands. The others watched. Marco, who could carve fluting faster than breathing. Lena, who had apprenticed in Cremona. Even Anya, who I'd tried so hard to keep as a friend, twisted her mouth as though bracing for a bad smell. Herr Futsch examined the scroll, running his finger over the ridges. Your choice of wood is ambitious, he said. His tone was unreadable, but others smirked. Someone snorted, let's hear it. I picked up my bow and drew it across the strings. What came out was not a child's screech. It was clear, silvered, tentative, but undeniably alive. I played the opening phrase of a Bach partita, fingers trembling in the chill. When the sound stopped, there was a moment of silence. Under the fluorescent lights, my floors blazed out. The purfling wobbled near the seabouts. The varnish was slightly cloudy along one rib. Even to me, the notes seemed too reserved, as if the violin and I were both apologizing just for existing. Herr Futsch coughed. Well, he said. His lips twisted into something sharp. The playing is better than the making. This is not Cremona. In Berlin we expect more ambition or less foolish dreams. There was laughter, brittle and unkind. Someone muttered, he thinks he'll be famous with that. Another said, my little sister made something like this in school. It rolled over me, an avalanche pretending to be a breeze. I stood there, red-cheeked and burning. The bow slipped in my hand. Anya caught my eye, but she looked away as soon as she realized I'd noticed. I set the violin back on the table, fighting to keep my hand steady, every instinct screaming to run. But I nodded, once heavily, and sat folding in on myself, focusing on the scent of sawdust still clinging to my shirt, until the world tunneled down to that alone. That's how it began. With humiliation thick as cold oil and patience born only from stubbornness. After the critique, I left the studio in a daze, violin case bumping my thigh. I caught the U1 at Görlitzer Bahnhof, the steel and glass blurring as the city zipped around me. I replayed their voices, their laughter, the warmth of their bodies pressed together against my solitary coldness. No matter how many times I listened, my heart thudded louder. At home, a tiny flat above a cafe, 3 floors up, too close to the S-Bahn for peace, I laid the violin on my table and stared at it. Hands bruised with failure, I tried to find the lines they had mocked. I couldn't, not really, because I knew what they didn't, that the shape was not made by tradition or rule but by memory and hope. Each chip of wood was a prayer, so I wept quietly so my neighbors wouldn't hear and promised myself I would not give up. My mother called that night. She lived in a little town north of Magdeburg. I could hear the television and the clinking of plates in the background. Why are you doing this? She asked tiredly. Why not something with security? An engineer like your cousins. They don't love it, I said, teeth tight. I do. She sighed, her faith in me stretching thinner every year. Dreams like yours, they make people laugh, Elias. Be careful you don't end up the jokes. It would have been easier to listen to her or to Herr Futsch or to the boy at the back of the studio with the mean smile. But the thing about making instruments is that it's an act of faith. A belief in sound, in hands, in the possibility that what you shape might outlast you. I worked. I rebuilt the violin. I finished school barely, the ridicule softening from open scorn to polite indifference. I took jobs, repairing school violas, fixing bows for students, gluing cracked guitars for buskers at Warschauer. Most days it didn't pay enough for more than potatoes and soup. Some nights I fell asleep with resin crusted under my fingernails. Years passed like rain. Slowly I built a reputation, not much of one, just enough that a chamber musician asked me for a new bridge. Then the cellist in his quartet wanted a custom tailpiece. My name spread in hushed, skeptical tones. Elias, the dreamer, the boy who thinks he can be a luthier in Berlin of all places. I kept my head down. I kept learning. Each new instrument was a little better, more resonant, smoother, less apologetic. I listened endlessly to the shape of sound, to the hands of the people who played them, sometimes to the ghosts of my own past. One morning, a decade after that first humiliation, I was binding off a cello in the new shop I rented, proper, with a window and real floorboards, when a tall, freckle-faced man stepped inside, snow softening on his jacket. He introduced himself as Anton Herz from the Berliner Philharmoniker. He had heard of me from a conductor who played a viola I'd made. "I need a violin," he said, "but not just any violin, I want something new. Something with a voice like nobody else." My hands wanted to tremble, but this time they didn't. I nodded. "Give me 6 months." 6 months is a lifetime if you count in heartbeats. I poured everything into that violin, years of ridicule, of patience, the memory of that first day in the studio, all the hunger and hope and pain. Every shiver in the wood, every sweep of the rasp was the sum of all the forfeits and all the faith. When it was finished, I ran my hand along the curved back, remembering where I had come from. I sanded the last edges, oiled the neck, set the bridge. And when Anton came for it, there was something in his eyes, something gentle and exacting. He played 3 notes, then he smiled and didn't speak for a very long minute. "It's alive," he finally murmured. "This is the soul I was hoping for." That was when things changed. Anton held a press conference at the hall, and on a frosty December evening, with lights blurred in the November dusk and the city's breath frostwhite in the air, he played my violin for an audience of 2,000. The sound soared. People closed their eyes to listen, the way they only do for greatness, like being inside the instrument itself. Reviewers wrote the next day that a new star had been crowned among Berlin's old guard of luthiers. Suddenly people found me. Cellists, violists, conservatory teachers, even Herr Futz, now retired but ageless in his opinions, turned up in my shop, his coat draped with certainty. He told me he had always believed in me in his way. I almost laughed, but I didn't. I just smiled and repaired the soundpost he'd damaged in his own ancient violin. But I had never returned to the studio on Oranienstrasse. I had never shown my family or community what became of that ridiculous dream. I was still, somewhere in the marrow, the boy they had dismissed. The invitation arrived on a blue embossed card, written in Lena's neat hand. 10 years since our graduation, and the school was throwing a reunion, a showcase of what their students had achieved. Herr Futz had nominated distinguished alumni to exhibit their work, to speak, to play. At the bottom, in smaller print, I read, "Your presence would enrich the event." I didn't want to accept. The old shame still lingered, sharp and heavy, a scar you could press on without pain but never quite forget. But my mother, her hair now streaked with grey, called when she heard the news. "Come home first," she said. "Let them see what you became. Let your uncle see." I made the drive up to Magdeburg, winding through low fields fringed with fog. My mother met me at the door, tired but proud, and my uncle, the engineer, came to dinner. He still believed I spent my days scraping glue and wasting potential. He asked if I'd fixed any toys lately. His eyes narrowed when I mentioned the Philharmoniker. Later, when I went to bed, I listened to the dull pulse of his voice through the wall, telling my mother not to raise her hopes. I left early the next morning, my violin packed in its case. The school's old studio hadn't changed, same chipped steps, same windows fogged with condensation. Lena greeted me at the door, her arms folded, her eyes softening as she took in the lines of my face. I noticed pride there, not the kind that glows but the kind that aches. "We're glad you came," she said. "I always believed you would." Inside, the air hummed with voices. 100 people pressed into the studio's narrow halls. Students, parents, teachers, a clutch of old faces from my class. I saw Marco still boasting. Anya changed in ways I couldn't name, even Herr Futz content among his trophies. My violin was placed at the front, glistening under the lights. There were others, Marco's curvaceous cello heavy with ornament, Lena's viola sleek as a whisper, a few high school instruments lined up like children at mass. I kept to the back, letting the crowd flow around me. There was laughter, old jokes, that particular pecking order you never really leave behind. When Herr Futz introduced me, Elias returning from the heights of fame, there was a tone not quite sarcastic, not quite proud. I nodded and stood beside my violin. The room was quiet, tense with expectation, a thin buzz of old and new rivalry. A young prodigy martyr came forward to play. She tucked the chin rest under her jaw. For a moment her breath fogged the maple. She drew the bow softly at first, then building, rich and gold and singing. I watched as the crowd shifted, the skeptics craning their necks, the engineers among them blinking, unable to parse what they heard. My uncle, hands folded over his belly, hair futch, silent for once. Anya, her lips parted in surprise. The music filled the space. It didn't apologize, it declared. The notes spun out, cascading along the arc of the ceiling until even the most jaded eyes softened. When Marta finished, there was a pause, then applause, loud and rising, echoing off the old concrete walls. Some students who had laughed at me years ago clapped hardest of all. A journalist from a Berlin paper asked for a word. "What drives you?" he said, notebook open. I looked at the faces gathered, the shame and pride and history wound together in one room. My mother stood near the door, her coat neat, hands tucked together, her eyes glistening. "Patience," I said, "that's all. Patience and believing even when no one else will. Wood doesn't care who you are, it sings if you let it." I met my uncle's eyes. He struggled, I saw, to accept, but he could not deny the sound. It filled the cracks in the room, the chasm of old doubts. Afterwards, people gathered around me asking questions. "Where did you learn? How long did it take?" Even Marco shook my hand, squeezing too hard but smiling with something like respect. When dusk thickened in the windows, I slipped away down the corridor, my violin case under my arm. Outside, the air was salty with the ache of Berlin in spring, damp leaves, subway grease, distant church bells. I looked back once, saw the glow through the curtained windows, the laughter and music carrying far into the night. I took the long road home past the silent river, hands tucked deep in my pockets and heart steadied by what I had seen. Rejection had been my teacher, struggle had been my companion, but success, I realized, is not proof to others. It is the moment when you no longer need to prove anything at all. It is a return not for them but for yourself. For the boy in the workshop, hands trembling, who quietly, stubbornly believed he could coax music from deadwood, and for the man walking into the Berlin night, no longer afraid to sing.